She was 13 years old, living on the south side of Chicago, and for one brief golden season her mother was happy. Not just content, not just managing, actually, genuinely, laughing in the kitchen happy. And if you grew up watching your mother carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, you know exactly what that moment feels like when she finally puts it down. You don't breathe too loud. You don't ask too many questions. You just let it be, because something in you knows this might not last. That's all Denise wanted, for her mom to be happy. And when Raymond walked through the door with grocery bags and a wide smile, it looked like maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what they were going to get. But here's the thing about people who know how to turn charm on. They also know how to turn it off. And what happened inside that apartment on the south side of Chicago would leave a mark so deep, so carefully embedded in the walls of who Denise was becoming, that she would spend the next 40 years of her life trying to find her way back to herself. This is her story. And I want you to stay with me because it's also, in some ways, yours. Raymond didn't walk into their lives like a villain. That's the part nobody ever talks about. And it's the part that matters most if you actually want to understand what happened. He walked in like a solution. It was the mid-1970s. South Chicago was a neighborhood built on steel, held together by Sunday church services, block parties, and the particular brand of survival that only comes from knowing that if you don't hold yourself up, nobody's coming to do it for you. The steel mills were still running then Inland Steel, U.S. Steel, the whole industrial corridor along the lake, and the men who worked them came home smelling like metal and exhaustion, hands rough, backs aching, but with a paycheck that meant something. It was hard work, honest work, the kind of work that a certain generation wore like a badge. Denise's mother was a woman raising 2 kids, mostly on her own. Denise was the older one, 13, watchful, already developing that particular sharpness that girls who grow up too fast tend to carry. Her younger brother Marcus was 10, softer, still in that stage of childhood where he wanted to believe everything was going to be fine. And their mother, Carol, was doing what she could. 2 jobs. Church on Sundays. A refrigerator that was never quite full enough, but never quite empty either. She was tired, the kind of tired that lives behind your eyes and doesn't go away with sleep. And then, Raymond showed up. He was a steelworker, broad-shouldered, dependable-looking, the kind of man who carried himself like he'd never asked anyone for anything in his life. He brought groceries without being asked. He laughed loud enough to fill whatever room he was in. He fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom that had been dripping for 8 months. He called Marcus, young man, and treated it like a title rather than a dismissal. And he looked at Carol like she was something worth looking at, which, after years of looking after everyone else, she had forgotten she was. Within 6 months, they were married, and for a little while it was good. Denise felt it, that unfamiliar warmth of a full refrigerator, a man at the head of the table, her mother's shoulders finally dropping away from her ears when she walked through the door at the end of the day. Marcus started laughing more. The apartment felt different, bigger somehow, even though nothing about it had physically changed. Even Denise, guarded as she already was at 13, let herself exhale, let herself believe that this was the version of things they were going to get. But then the laughter stopped. It didn't happen overnight. That's what's so insidious about it. It crept in the way cold creeps into an old building slowly, through gaps you forgot to seal, until one day you realize you've been shivering for a long time without noticing exactly when it started. Raymond's discipline started with Marcus. Small corrections at first, a raised voice over a spilled glass, a hand that lingered a half second too long on the shoulder, not hitting, just holding, just reminding the boy that the hand was there and that it could decide to do something other than rest. He always had a reason, always had a justification wrapped neatly in the language of fatherhood. This is what the boy needs. I'm just doing what nobody else will. You coddle him and he'll amount to nothing. And Carol, exhausted, grateful, in love, believed him. That's not a criticism. It's important to say that. Carol was not a foolish woman. She was a woman who had been surviving alone for years and had finally found what looked like solid ground. And she was not going to question the ground, because questioning it might mean it disappeared. That is a rational response to an irrational situation. That is what prolonged hardship does to a person's judgment, not breaks it, but bends it, slowly, in the direction of what they need to be true. Here's where the story gets complicated. And I want you to sit with the complication rather than rushing past it, because this is the part that actually matters. This is not a story about a monster hiding behind a mask. I know that's a more comfortable story to tell. Monsters are easy. Monsters are other. Monsters don't bring groceries and fix leaky faucets and make your exhausted mother laugh for the first time in years. Monsters don't look like solutions. Raymond was ordinary harm. The kind that doesn't arrive announcing itself. The kind that doesn't leave obvious bruises, or at least, not at first. Not the kind anyone outside the apartment would see. The kind that works slowly, on the inside, the way rust works. You don't notice it until the structure has already been compromised. For Marcus, the harm came through invisibility. Raymond's discipline was unpredictable enough that the safest strategy was to make yourself as small as possible, to become the kind of boy who agreed with whatever was said, who moved quietly through the apartment, who ate his meals without calling attention to himself, who measured his laughter against the temperature of the room before allowing it out. Marcus learned to disappear inside himself. He learned to be present without being there. And in the context of that household, in the short term, that worked. But Denise went the other direction entirely. When Raymond's discipline turned toward her, and it did, because it always does, because men like Raymond need everyone in the house to acknowledge the weight of them, something shifted in Denise at a molecular level. She was 13. She didn't have the language for what was happening. She didn't have a therapist or a hotline or a guidance counselor who actually listened, rather than just documented. She didn't have the framework of trauma response or attachment theory or any of the vocabulary we'd use today to describe what was being done to her and her family. What she had was instinct. Animal, bone deep, 13-year-old instinct. And her instinct told her, become someone he cannot reach. So she did. She got loud. Deliberately, strategically loud. She talked back when talking back was dangerous. She held Raymond's gaze a beat too long when he was trying to intimidate. She rolled her eyes when his jaw tightened, which was either the bravest or the most reckless thing a kid in her position could do, and depending on the day, it was probably both. She wore her attitude like a suit of armor, putting on a new piece every time Raymond pushed, until she had built something around herself that was almost impenetrable. Raymond couldn't crack her. He tried. He tried different approaches, the cold silence, the sudden kindness designed to catch her off guard, the public shaming at the dinner table, the attempts to get Carol to discipline her on his behalf. But Denise had an internal compass that Raymond couldn't confiscate, and every time he thought he had her cornered, she slipped through some gap he hadn't accounted for. She walked away from those confrontations with her chin up, and she made sure he saw it. Her brother went invisible. Denise went untouchable. Same house, same threat. Two completely different survival strategies, and both of them logical. Both of them sensible given the specific shape of the person doing them. Marcus was 10 and soft-hearted and needed to get through each day without escalating things. Denise was 13 and already hard-edged in the specific way that girls who've been watching and waiting since childhood tend to get. The armor fit her because she'd already been building it, slowly, for years before Raymond arrived. He just gave her a reason to finish the job. The armor worked. Raymond never truly got to Denise the way he got to others in that apartment. He never broke her down, never got her to small herself the way he'd gotten Marcus to small himself. The way he'd gotten Carol to second-guess what she was seeing with her own eyes. In the context of that childhood, in the specific geography of that apartment on the south side of Chicago, Denise's armor was a triumph. But armor doesn't just keep danger out, it keeps everything out. And that's the part of the story that nobody tells, because the story usually ends at survival. The story usually ends with the kid who made it out, the adult who built a life. The before and after framing that lets us feel like there was a clean break between the hard thing and everything that came after. But there is no clean break. That's not how any of this works. What happens when the threat is gone, but the walls are still standing? What happens when you're 25, 35, 45 years old, and you've spent so long being unreachable that you've genuinely forgotten what it felt like to be reached? What happens when the person you built to survive starts surviving you? What happens when your armor becomes your prison? That's the question Denise has spent her adult life trying to answer. And it is not a small question. It is not a quick fix. And it did not have a clean ending, not for a long, long time. Denise grew up. She left that apartment. Raymond eventually faded out of their lives the way those men often do, not with drama, not with a confrontation that would at least give everyone something to point to, but with distance, a gradual evaporation. One day he was there, and then he was less there, and then he wasn't. The marriage ended. Carol rebuilt, slowly, in the particular way that women who've survived things rebuild quietly, without much fanfare, with a wariness in the eyes that hadn't been there before. Denise graduated, got a job, left the South Side and built something that looked, from the outside, like a life. A career she was good at. She was smart, driven, the kind of woman who walked into a room and took up space without apologizing for it. An apartment of her own, friends who respected her. By every external measure, she had made it out. But something kept not adding up. The relationships kept falling apart. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently, at a certain depth. She'd date someone, and things would be good for a while. Light, easy, the surface stuff. And then they'd try to go deeper. They'd try to actually get to her. And something in her would trip a wire. An alarm that had been installed at 13 and never, in all the years since, been uninstalled. She'd pull back, go cold, become that girl again without meaning to the untouchable one. The one with the chin up and the sharp tongue and the absolute, bedrock certainty that needing someone was the same as giving them something to use against you. The people who loved her called it walls. Therapists, she saw a few over the years, each time convincing herself this one would be different, then stopping when it started to actually be different, would call it an avoidant attachment response. Denise just called it Tuesday. She was functional, successful even. She told herself she was fine, and in many important ways, she was. But the fine was a specific kind of fine, the kind that works in straight lines and falls apart in circles. She could handle crisis. She was extraordinary in crisis. Give her a problem to solve, an obstacle to get around, something to push against, and she was in her element. But intimacy, the slow, circular, repetitive work of actually being known by another person that she could not do. That was the shape of what Raymond had left behind. Not dramatic damage, not a breakdown or a collapse, just a woman in her 30s, then her 40s, who was excellent at surviving and could not figure out why peace felt so foreign. It wasn't until her late 40s, 40 years, roughly, after Raymond first walked through that door with grocery bags and a smile, that something finally cracked open enough to let the light in. It started with a friendship ending. Not a romantic relationship, this time a friendship, which made it harder to dismiss. A woman she'd known for 15 years, someone who had been patient and consistent and genuinely present, told her plainly, "I don't know how to love you when you won't let me see you." And Denise, who had an answer for everything, didn't have an answer for that. She sat with it for 3 months. And then she found a therapist, a different kind this time, someone who specialized in exactly the intersection of childhood adversity and adult relational patterns, and she sat down across from her and said the words out loud for the first time. Not about Raymond, not at first. It started smaller than that. I don't know why I can't let people in. And from that one thread, they pulled, slowly, carefully. The way you pull a thread that's load-bearing, knowing that things are going to shift, that the structure is going to feel different, that some things might come undone before they can be rebuilt. And what unraveled was enormous. Because here's what trauma does that we don't always talk about, and I want you to really hear this part. It doesn't just wound you. It doesn't just hurt you and leave a scar. It reorganizes you. It takes the raw material of who you were in the process of becoming and reshapes it, completely, around the wound. The wound doesn't sit inside your personality like a splinter you can remove. The wound becomes load-bearing. The wound becomes the architecture. Denise didn't just survive Raymond. She became someone specifically engineered to survive Raymond. Her sharpness, her self-sufficiency, her absolute refusal to be reached, those weren't personality flaws. They were adaptations. They were extraordinarily intelligent responses to an extraordinarily difficult situation. The 13-year-old girl who built that armor was not broken. She was brilliant. She read the situation accurately and responded in the most effective way available to her. The tragedy wasn't that she built the armor. The tragedy was that nobody ever came to help her take it off when the war was over. And so she kept wearing it. Through her 20s, through her 30s and 40s, past every relationship that might have helped her put it down. If only she'd been able to let them get close enough to try. The armor had protected her, and then the armor had imprisoned her. And she had been so focused on surviving each day that she hadn't noticed she was serving a life sentence inside the thing that had once saved her life. Here is the part of Denise's story that I think is the most remarkable, and I want you to sit with it for a long moment before we move on. She did the work. 40 years later, not as a teenager with access to resources, not as a young adult when the damage might have been easier to address, but at 40-something, a fully formed person with decades of patterns and habits and defenses all stacked on top of each other. She sat in a therapist's office and she did the work. She went back into the machinery of herself, found the place where a 13-year-old girl had made a decision that saved her, and she started, piece by piece, session by session, year by year, to understand what that decision had cost her. Not to erase the girl who survived, not to pretend the armor had been a mistake, or that the defiance and the sharp tongue and the raised chin had been weaknesses. Not to become someone soft and unguarded and naive about the world's capacity for harm, but to finally give that girl some rest. Because that's the thing about what we build to survive hard things. It deserves respect. Every single piece of it deserves respect. It worked. It kept you here. It got you to the other side of something that could have destroyed you, and it didn't. And that is not nothing. That is everything. The armor was not the problem. The armor was the solution. The problem was that the solution had outlasted the original crisis by 4 decades. At some point, you have to look at what you've built and say, thank you. Thank you for getting me here. And now I've got it from here. Denise said it herself, years into therapy. I survived Raymond by becoming someone he couldn't get to. The trouble was, nobody else could get to her either. That line stopped me the first time I heard it. I want you to feel the weight of it. Because it's not a simple tragedy, it's a complicated one. She had done exactly what she needed to do. And exactly what she needed to do had become the thing standing between her and everything she wanted. That is the specific cruelty of adaptive trauma response. It succeeds. It works so well, for so long, that by the time you realize it's hurting you, it feels like the most fundamental part of who you are. How do you dismantle something that feels like yourself? Slowly. That's the answer. Slowly and with help and with an enormous amount of grief, because somewhere in that process you have to grieve the life that might have been, the relationships that might have gone deeper. The version of yourself that might have existed if a man with grocery bags and a wide smile hadn't walked through a door when you were 13 years old and rearranged everything. You grieve it. And then, you keep going. Marcus found his own path too, though it took him longer in some ways and shorter in others. The invisible boy had to learn, in adulthood, that he was allowed to take up space. That the smallness he'd practiced every day in that apartment wasn't the truth of who he was. It was a costume he'd put on to get through, and he was allowed to take it off. He had to practice existing loudly, practice having opinions, practice saying no without bracing for the consequences. It took time. It took its own version of the long, slow work of unwinding what Raymond had wound tight. But he did it. Both of them did. A 13-year-old girl who built herself into someone untouchable. A 10-year-old boy who learned to disappear. Both of them, in their own time, on their own terms, went back for the pieces of themselves they'd had to leave behind in that apartment, and they reclaimed them. That is not a small thing. I want you to understand how enormous that is. Most people never go back. Most people keep wearing the armor, keep doing the disappearing act, keep surviving the war that ended years ago because going back is hard, and the armor is comfortable by now, and the disappearing is so practiced, it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It just feels like who you are. To go back anyway, to choose, deliberately, to sit with someone in a room and say, I think something happened to me, and I think it's still happening, and I think I need help. That is courage. Not the loud, visible kind. The quiet, unglamorous, sitting in a therapist's office crying about a man you haven't seen in 30 years kind. That's the hardest kind. And that's the kind that actually changes things. How many of us are still wearing something we built for a war that's over? How many of us are still protecting ourselves from people who aren't in the room anymore? Still running survival strategies designed for a childhood that ended decades ago? The danger has passed, but the posture hasn't. The threat is gone, but the defenses are still up, still scanning, still costing us things we want and can't figure out why we can't seem to hold on to. If any part of Denise's story landed somewhere in you good, it's supposed to. These are the stories that matter, because they're not really about someone else. They never are. If you want more of them, subscribe, because we're not done, and the next one matters just as much as this one. And drop a comment below. I want to hear from you. Have you ever caught yourself protecting yourself from something that isn't even there anymore? Have you ever looked at your own armor and wondered when you put it on, and whether you'd even know how to take it off? Tell me. That's what the comments are for. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.